You are listening to the Tales of Conundrum podcast, Episode 14, The Future Awaits. Part 1, The Hustle. Stanley King stood beneath the bright morning sun, the steady hum of traffic and chatter buzzing around him. A small square table sat at his side, its worn edges sporting faint marks of previous performances. It was a perfectly ordinary setup for an unassuming street performer, except that Stanley possessed a talent unlike any other. He could see up to 24 hours into the future. Not in perfect clarity, but clear enough to know exactly what would happen in the short term, and hazier as those events approached the edge of his ability. Stanley's early days of testing this power had taught him caution. Drawing too much attention could lead to trouble. People with the ability to predict the near future quickly found themselves hunted or exploited. So he hid in plain sight, a man with a tabletop, a few props, and a knack for astonishing coincidences. His living came from buskers' tips, QR code donations, and the occasional bewildered tourist who simply had to give him a few dollars for the show. He was never flashy beyond reason, never overly pushing the boundaries of disbelief. That's how he kept himself safe. Late that morning, the crowd had formed a rough half-circle around him. A curious hush settled in as he invited a tall African-American man to come forward. Stanley forced a friendly smile and made a show of slowly taking out a black marker. He pressed the tip to a notepad, considering the man before him. He knew from his short-term visions that the man's name was Sean, and that he had a favorite number, something curious called a Julian birth date. The precision of Stanley's knowledge always peaked in the first few hours, where his sight worked almost flawlessly. "Sir," Stanley said to the volunteer, "please hold your answers for a moment." With a flourish, Stanley scribbled onto a small piece of paper, then quickly folded it and slid it beneath a smooth wooden block on the table. He turned to the rest of the onlookers and picked a woman standing to his right, asking her to provide the first question. She said, "His name." Then Stanley turned to a blind man in the crowd, who suggested asking about the volunteer's favorite number. Stanley turned back to the volunteer, still wearing that practiced, genial smile. "Now please," he said, "tell us your name." "Sean," the man answered. "And your favorite number?" Sean shrugged, looking pleasantly baffled by the routine. "It's my Julian birth date, so 211. A murmur of excitement swept through the audience. Stanley gestured for Sean to retrieve the paper from beneath the wooden block. The man picked it up gingerly and read, "Sean." I beg Sybil cheers erupted. A few spectators pulled out their wallets, while others aimed their phones at a QR code sign that Stanley had taped neatly to the corner of his table. The swirl of applause, laughter, and hurried footsteps to donate filled the air with a lively buzz. Stanley bowed with humility, but there was a glint in his eyes. This trick was good, but what he had planned next would leave them speechless. He looked at the crowd. "If I can collect $323 right now," he announced, "I'll show you something I only do once a week. I call it the blind toss." Whether by curiosity or sheer generosity, the spectators complied. Some handed over bills, others tapped on their phones to send digital payments. Before long, an older woman with glasses signaled to Stanley that they had reached the total. He nodded and called for a volunteer. A young man, fair-skinned and dressed in a tank top and shorts, stepped forward confidently. Stanley slipped a blindfold over the volunteer's eyes and placed a pebble in his hand. "Don't move until I give you the signal," Stanley instructed. Then he turned, scanning the area with a calculating gaze. In his short-term visions, he could see precisely where the pebble would land. Still, he had to remain calm, guiding reality in such a way that it never seemed too impossible. Stanley wandered a few paces from the volunteer, placing a plastic cup on the pavement in what looked like a random spot. The audience parted to allow him through, forming an impromptu corridor as he gently positioned the cup. A quiet sense of anticipation rippled through the crowd. "All right," Stanley called out. "Everyone, count down from 5. When you reach 1, shout, 'Throw.'" As if choreographed, the crowd chanted, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, throw. The volunteer tossed the pebble directly above him. It soared into the air, twirling in a small arc. An errant breeze nudged it off course, then another gust corrected its path, a precarious dance of shifting wind. Yet Stanley barely flinched. He had foreseen this. With a small bounce, the pebble plopped into the cup with a muted clink. A chorus of gasps and cheers erupted. Some people hopped in excitement. Others pointed their phones to capture the moment. The volunteer removed the blindfold, mouth ajar at the improbability of what he'd just done. Stanley offered a modest bow, looking equal parts proud and relieved. Moments like these reminded him of the tightrope he walked. He couldn't demonstrate his abilities constantly. People needed doubt to rationalize what they saw. Too many miracles in a row led to suspicion. That's why he only performed the blind toss trick once a week, to maintain mystery, to keep the line between coincidence and mastery blurred. As the crowd dispersed, some onlookers lingered to ask casual questions. "How long have you been doing this?" "Where did you learn your trick?" Stanley answered with practiced half-truths. "Just a knack," he would say with a shrug and a grin. "Been around a while. You pick up a thing or two." Eventually, the sidewalk cleared. The sun had shifted to a late afternoon warmth, and he decided it was time to pack up. Slipping the wooden block, the cup, and the leftover bills into a small duffel bag, he was about to head off for a well-deserved rest when a sudden chill raced down his spine. In the corner of his eye, he caught the figure of a woman buying an ice cream cone from a cart down the block. There was nothing overtly remarkable about her at first glance, just another passerby in the city. Yet for Stanley, her presence rippled with a sense of wrongness, that placid space in his mind where the immediate future was always so vivid, flickered. He couldn't see her next move. It was as if the next 24 hours surrounding that singular person were dipped in fog. Stanley swallowed, trying to suppress the surge of adrenaline. Everything else about the next few moments was perfectly predictable to him. Where the ice cream vendor would step, how the cabs would line up at the traffic light, even the precise timing of the sunset. But anything involving this stranger was a complete blank, like trying to read a page with all the words erased. He zipped his duffel bag shut and took a hesitant step forward, deciding to approach her. The sense of emptiness in his predictive vision sharpened. She casually turned a corner behind a building, out of his line of sight for a moment. Stanley quickened his pace, almost jogging, the taste of panic on his tongue, something he rarely felt these days. Reaching the corner, he peered around, scanning the sidewalks, the parked cars, even the little bookstore entrance. But she was gone. The chill remained, like an echo of something he couldn't quite grasp. Stanley's mind reeled with questions he couldn't answer, and that was the strangest feeling of all. He usually knew everything that mattered within the coming day, well enough to avoid real surprises. Yet here he stood, haunted by a flicker of emptiness, uncertain how or why it had happened. The late afternoon sun suddenly felt cooler, the city's usual bustle taking on a peculiar hush. Holding his breath, he waited a beat longer, searching for any sign of her. Nothing. His heart thudded heavily in his chest, a reminder of an unfamiliar vulnerability. Finally, he exhaled. There were no more glimpses to rely upon, no hidden vantage point telling him where she might have disappeared to. It was just blank. He clutched the duffel bag as if it anchored him. With evening settling in, he realized there was little else to do but return to his cramped studio apartment and puzzle over the emptiness that lingered like a shadow in his mind. Pulling up his collar against a sudden gust of wind, Stanley turned away, heading down the sidewalk with purposeful strides. He felt as though he had stepped from a well-lit corridor into uncharted darkness, and nothing in his life so far had prepared him for that. Yet the question remained, who was she? More importantly, why couldn't he see her future? He had no answers, only a gnawing, disquieting hush. And as he walked away, for the first time in years, Stanley King felt truly uncertain about what tomorrow might bring. Part 2. Mystery Woman. Stanley King woke to a sky filled with light that felt warmer than it had the day before. The city's pulse beat through his studio apartment window, a mix of impatient car horns and distant chatter beckoning him to return to the sidewalk stage. He packed his usual gear, his small collapsible table, a few note cards, a wooden block, and the black marker he'd come to rely on. As he stepped onto the bustling street, he tried to ignore the lingering memory of that unsettling blank spot in his vision. By mid-morning, he'd found a fresh patch of pavement to set up, far enough from yesterday's location that his audience would be new, but close enough to catch the same curious stream of passers-by. He spread out his table and placed the wooden block in plain view, the note cards stacked neatly beside it. A small crowd formed, drawn by the promise of something extraordinary. He greeted them with a friendly nod. "Step right up. Let's play a little guessing game," Stanley announced. His words were smooth, practiced, but he could feel a faint tremor beneath his voice, remembering how rattled he'd been by that mysterious woman's sudden disappearance. He singled out a few onlookers to ask quick questions, names, favorite songs, simple math riddles, and casually demonstrated his knack for writing the answers before they were spoken. Everything proceeded with the comforting predictability that had shaped his life since he first discovered his gift. Then, without warning, the predictable flow faltered. In his vision, though it was more of a feeling than a visual cue, he had anticipated calling upon a lanky college student in a red t-shirt. That was who he'd seen stepping forward. But instead, a different figure approached the table, a woman wearing a subtle smile and holding a half-finished cup of coffee. Instantly, Stanley's mind went blank. He blinked hard, willing himself to see some snippet of her words, her name, anything. But all he found was static. She looked at him expectantly. The crowd, growing impatient, shifted their attention. Someone whispered, "Isn't he going to write something down?" Stanley's hand twitched over the stack of note cards, heart pounding. He had no clue what answer he was meant to write. This was just like yesterday, that same oppressive gap in his foresight. He steadied himself. Let's do this," he said, forcing a grin. He scribbled the number 8 on a note card, folded it, and slid it under the wooden block. It was a shot in the dark, an attempt to bluff his way through. Clearing his throat, he nodded at the woman. "Please share a number between 1 and 10. She paused, touching her chin thoughtfully. 8, she said at last. A wave of stunned relief washed over him. He motioned for her to pick up the card from beneath the block. The woman held it up for the onlookers to see. Indeed, Stanley had written the number 8. A mild ripple of clapping broke out from the crowd. Yet the excitement was lukewarm at best. A 1 in 10 guess didn't seem that impressive compared to the mind-boggling predictions he usually made. A few people drifted away, unimpressed by the simplicity. Stanley pretended not to notice, but the moment cut deeper than he let on. He thanked the audience for stopping by, offering half smiles as the last of them turned away. By the time he packed up his note cards and marker, only the mysterious woman lingered. The buzz of the city carried on around them. A bus screeched to a halt at the corner, and a distant saxophone played a lonely tune down the block. The woman tilted her head, studying him. "You don't remember me, do you?" she asked, her voice tinged with a curious warmth. Stanley froze. "Should I?" She gave a small laugh. "I was there yesterday, right beside you while everyone was throwing cash into that collection. I even gave you $20. You were setting up that blind toss trick." He tried to recall, but his mind was a haze of handshakes, passing faces, glinting phone screens, and swirling applause. Sorry, I'm usually good with faces, but I guess it was busy." A flash of disappointment crossed her features, but she shook it off gracefully. "That's all right. You looked preoccupied." Stanley's heart picked up speed. In truth, he'd been more than preoccupied. He'd been shaken by the fact that she was the only person in view whose future he couldn't see. Yet, here she stood again, as mysterious as a half-remembered dream. He cleared his throat. "You, said your favorite number was 8? She nodded. "I do like 8. I'm not sure why, it's just always appealed to me." He found himself smiling despite the tension in his gut. "It's a good choice. 2 circles stacked on top of each other." Then he hesitated, sensing a hint of curiosity behind her eyes. "If you don't mind me asking, what do you do? For work, I mean." She shrugged. "I'm an analyst. I look at data and figure out patterns." That piece of information settled in Stanley's mind, a small but intriguing detail. So she was bright and analytical, someone who spent her days unraveling complexities. Instinctively, he worried what might happen if she ever trained that keen mind on him and his unexplained abilities. Before he could dwell on that, she spoke again. "Listen, I just had to see more of your performances. Yesterday was something else, but I was surprised you only went for a 1 in 10 guess today. His cheeks warmed at the gentle reproach in her tone. Yeah, it was, an off day, he admitted. She reached out, briefly touching his forearm in a sympathetic gesture. I guess even street magicians have those, right? He nodded, unsure how to respond. There was something undeniably captivating about her candor. Perhaps it was simply that she was an enigma to him, free from the careful choreographing he usually experienced. For a moment he realized he was seeing life how everyone else must see it, completely unpredictable. It thrilled him and left him a bit uneasy all at once. She flicked her gaze down the street, then back to him. Well, thanks for letting me watch again. Wait, he said, almost too quickly, a surge of boldness guiding him. I know I didn't exactly wow you today, but how about we grab some ice cream instead? I need a little pick-me-up after that less-than-stellar show. The woman considered him, bemused. Ice cream, huh? That's a step up from a 1 in 10 chance. He laughed softly, relieved that she wasn't brushing him off. I'd like to think the odds are better than that. She didn't respond right away, letting the silence stretch between them, the clamor of the city filling in the edges. Finally, she nodded. Sure, let's do it. Gathering his table and props, he stuffed them into a plain backpack. They began to walk down the block, side by side. The weather was mild, with the faint smell of roasted peanuts from a nearby cart mingling with the exhaust fumes of the passing buses. Stanley gave quick, polite nods to a few folks who still recognized him from the crowd. As the two strolled, he realized just how extraordinary it felt, not knowing what the next few seconds might bring. At least, not when it involved the woman beside him. He didn't know if she'd laugh at his jokes, or if she'd suddenly decide she had somewhere else to be. The ever-present awareness that he lacked his usual foresight near her gave every moment a crisp edge, like tasting a flavor for the first time. They approached an ice cream cart with colorful umbrellas overhead. She glanced over the flavors: chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, mint chip, while he simply observed her, amused by how genuinely enthralling the mundane could be when you couldn't predict it. Chocolate or mint chip? She asked. He paused. I'd guess you're a mint chip person. She raised an eyebrow. Is that another magic trick? Stanley shrugged, fighting down a grin. Nope, just intuition. Her returning smile made his stomach do a small flip. She ordered 2 cones, 1 in each flavor, and handed him the mint chip. They continued walking, occasionally pausing to lick at the quickly melting treat. Stanley's thoughts ran in circles. If only I could see her next move, he mused. It would calm my nerves. Yet, oddly enough, he found himself not wanting that comfort. He realized he liked the uncertainty in her eyes, the way each passing breath held a question mark. They turned onto a quieter street, away from the bustle. So, she said, how long have you been doing your show? He explained that he'd been at it for a few years, traveling through various cities. He kept the details spare, just in case. She nodded, listening attentively, though he sensed she had more questions. The sun was beginning its long descent, painting the sky with a faint tint of orange. Each step they took felt like a new page in a story he hadn't read before. By the time they reached a small park at the end of the block, Stanley had nearly forgotten the day's earlier embarrassment with the number trick. He looked at her, brimming with curiosity and only a small thread of caution. Ice cream was a great idea, he said. I needed this. She smiled softly in return. Yeah, me too. They fell into a comfortable silence as they passed a group of children playing tag on the grass. For once, Stanley felt no desire to peer around the corner of time. Just being here, in the present, felt exhilarating. As he caught the hint of another question forming on her lips, Stanley realized he didn't know how the conversation would turn. Yet that only made the moment more vibrant. He took a slow breath, letting the unfamiliar sensations sink in. He glanced over at her one more time, taking in the subdued smile, the inquisitive shine in her eyes. He thought back to how just yesterday, she'd vanished from his sight completely, leaving him rattled. Now here she was, walking beside him, vivid and undeniably real. And he, Stanley King, The man who prided himself on knowing nearly everything before it happened had no idea what was coming next. Part 3. Love and Secrets. From the first day they shared an ice cream cone, Stanley and Nikki seemed to discover a connection that neither of them had anticipated. Their simple strolls around the city evolved into late-night coffees, brunches at tiny sidewalk cafes, and lazy afternoons meandering through art galleries. Weeks blurred into months as they navigated each other's interests and quirks. Stanley found himself surprisingly delighted by Nikki's knack for noticing the slightest detail, like the splash of teal on a mural's corner or the fleeting constellations of bubbles in her latte. He had never let anyone get this close before. Usually, he maintained a polite, friendly distance from new people, a kind of unspoken barrier. But with Nikki, each day felt like a new beginning, an unknown trajectory he genuinely loved experiencing. It was as though he were discovering life in real time, without the safety net he'd grown so used to depending on. The simplest interactions with her ignited wonder. Would she try a new dish at dinner or pick her favorite standby? Would she suggest a concert by some indie band or propose a weekend drive to a nearby lake? He found himself embracing the uncertainty, cherishing the fact that she was a mystery that no routine could spoil. Yet despite his open heart, Stanley harbored a quiet worry. Sometimes he seemed unusually cautious around strangers who stared too long at him on the street, or he'd gently steer Nikki away from certain neighborhoods with no clear explanation. She'd raise an eyebrow, but never pressed the issue, at least not yet. On more than one occasion he'd joke, "I've just got a nose for trouble," and laugh it off. Under the surface, though, he wrestled with how much he should share about his life, or how little. Nikki's gentle, inquisitive nature chipped at his reservations day by day, but his unease lingered like a whisper. As the months passed, Nikki and Stanley built a vibrant tapestry of quiet, steady companionship. They discovered a shared love for old science fiction novels, sometimes swapping tattered paperbacks and annotating the margins with playful commentary. On rainy days, they'd curl up in her living room, talking about the oddities of life and what small joys they looked forward to in the future. Though Stanley felt he was holding something back, some crucial piece of himself, he found solace in every moment they spent together. He believed that once the time was right, he would know how to invite her fully into his world. One crisp autumn weekend, Stanley surprised Nikki with a trip to a small winery nestled on the outskirts of a verdant valley. They took a 3-hour drive out of the city, winding through roads lined with burnt orange foliage and distant rolling hills. Nikki peered out the passenger window, marveling at each russet tree and winding creek they passed. When they arrived, the winery's quaint cottage architecture and rows of grapevines greeted them under a bright blue sky. The earthy scent of oak barrels and crushed grapes lingered in the air, mingling with the perfume of freshly tilled soil. Nikki was all smiles and sunlit laughter, swirling a glass of red wine and quipping that it tasted like a lazy summer day in fruit form. Stanley nodded, more focused on the rhythm of her voice than the actual flavor of the drink. As the afternoon waned, they wandered through the vineyard hand in hand. The sky transitioned from pale gold to dusky pink, and then deeper into the inky blue that heralded nightfall. Strings of soft lights illuminated the wooden patio, where a few other couples chatted in hushed tones. Stanley guided Nikki to a quieter patch of lawn beside a gently sloping hill. There, the stars were unobstructed, an endless canopy of shimmering possibilities. The moment felt perfect, yet Stanley's heart hammered. Every small step, every breath, felt monumental. He had spent weeks planning this, deciding on the details, dreaming of the day he would commit to the one person who made him feel free from the weight of everything he'd never spoken of. He took a shaky breath, letting Nikki's soft laughter calm his nerves. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small box, unadorned except for a faded bow. He began, fighting the catch in his throat. "There's something about you," he continued, his voice trembling slightly. "I've never met anyone who made the world so exciting." Nikki's eyes widened, her lips parted in anticipation. He opened the box to reveal a ring made of Preseli bluestone, a stone with swirling patterns of deep blues and greens. Under the fairy lights, it caught a gentle gleam. Stanley had chosen it for its symbolism of grounding and focus. He hoped it would speak to how Nikki made him feel anchored in the present moment. She pressed a hand to her mouth, tears glimmering at the corners of her eyes. "Oh, Stanley." He knelt, feeling the soft grass and the cool night breeze against him. "You've changed my life. You've shown me that something I was afraid to face could actually be—" He swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. "Everything I didn't know I wanted. Will you—" "Yes," she interrupted, laughter mingling with tears. "I don't even need to hear the whole speech. My answer is yes." For an instant, all the world seemed to hold its breath. The winery lights glowed like stars fallen to earth, and the real stars sparkled in the sky above. Stanley slipped the ring onto her finger, relieved to find that it fit perfectly, a detail he'd taken pains to ensure. Nikki threw her arms around him, pulling him close in a rush of joy. He felt her heart beating fast against his, and for a moment, he couldn't recall why he had ever felt hesitant or afraid. Later that evening, they returned to the cottage where they were staying, just long enough to share a celebratory glass of champagne and soak in the reality of what had happened. Stanley noticed a new gleam in Nikki's eyes, a dreamlike wonder mirrored in his own. Though he still carried silent questions about how he would reconcile the hidden parts of his life, the warmth of her acceptance was enough to silence those doubts for now. They held each other, content to let the night pass in blissful celebration. The following morning, they said goodbye to the vineyard, the early sun painting the vines with gentle light. Their final glasses of wine remained a sweet memory on their lips as they loaded the car, eager to head back to the city as an officially engaged couple. The drive home felt shorter, as if the countryside itself sped them along with well wishes. They chatted about wedding venues, maybe something small and intimate, or possibly a bigger affair with friends and family, and discussed everything from caterers to whether they should get a tiny band to play jazz at the reception. All the while, Stanley felt a blend of joy and anticipation stirring in his chest. He glanced at Nikki's left hand, where the bluestone ring caught the sunlight. In that moment, he vowed to treasure every second of this new chapter, hopeful that love would provide the courage he needed when the time came to share his deepest secrets. For now, though, they both leaned into the ecstasy of possibility. As the city skyline appeared on the horizon, they exchanged a knowing smile. Life had changed in the span of a single night beneath the stars, and neither of them could wait to see what came next. Part 4. Truths Revealed. A gentle spring breeze swept through the sun-dappled city park where Stanley and Nikki sat on a checkered blanket, leaning into each other with the unspoken intimacy of two people newly engaged and brimming with delight in every shared breath. Around them, children chased soccer balls, and parents mingled in hushed conversations. The scene felt idyllic, until Stanley's heartbeat began to thunder in his ears at the thought of the secret he was about to divulge. Nikki peered up at him, concern shadowing her warm gaze. "You're quiet today," she observed, setting her paper cup of lemonade aside. He offered a tight-lipped smile, fighting the urge to avert his eyes. "I've been thinking about us," he began. "About how much I trust you. How much I want to share everything with you." She reached for his hand, her engagement ring catching a ray of sunlight. "I'm all ears," she replied softly. Stanley inhaled, preparing for words he had practiced so many times in his head. "Nikki, there's something unusual about me. I can see events before they happen." A slow furrow appeared between her brows, as if she were trying to parse the meaning behind his statement. "You mean, like a hunch? Or you read signs better than other people?" "More than that," he said, voice trembling with gravity. "I can see the future, but only for the next 24 hours. After that, it gets fuzzy." Nikki's grip on his hand tightened. Her expression was a swirl of curiosity and disbelief. "Then how does it—" "I'll show you," he interjected. Rising from the blanket, he extended his hand, and she stood with him. They walked a short distance to the edge of the pond, where a few ducks and geese floated lazily. Just within reach on the water's surface drifted a small leaf, pale green and jagged at the edges. Stanley steadied himself, letting the hush of his foresight fall into place. The immediate future glimmered in his mind like a half-lit path. "Watch that leaf," he whispered, guiding Nikki's focus to it. "In exactly 3 minutes and 23 seconds, a fish will nibble it, and a goose will swoop down to catch that fish." She glanced at the pond, then at him, an incredulous laugh escaping her lips. "A goose catching a fish?" she asked. "That's pretty rare, right?" "Rare, but not impossible." Stanley checked his phone for the exact time, then slipped it back into his pocket. He lifted Nikki's hand to his chest, letting her feel the thud of his heart. Every breath felt like an exclamation point as they waited, kneeling side by side at the pond's edge. The seconds ticked by as if balanced on a razor's edge. With 1 minute left, Nikki stopped even blinking, her hand trembling slightly against Stanley's. 30 seconds, 20, 10. Then, it happened. A tiny ripple shimmered beneath the leaf as a curious fish emerged, bumping and nibbling at the leaf's underside. Nikki's hand flew to her mouth, a muffled gasp escaping her. She barely had a moment to process the oddity before a dark shape streaked out of the sky. A goose, wings flapping in sudden fury, dove toward the water. The bird's long neck struck in a flash, catching the fish in its beak and flapping away to the far side of the pond. The entire scene lasted no more than 2 seconds, yet it felt like time had dripped into slow motion. Nikki's eyes went round, her stance wobbly with shock. "How?" she began, but her words caught in her throat. Stanley could only exhale, feeling a surreal lightness at having shown the one person he loved most what he'd kept hidden from nearly everyone else. "I've lived with this for a long time," he said, guiding her away from the pond's edge. "I always know what's coming, except when it has to do with you." She stared at him, chin trembling. "I don't understand. I mean, you predicted that down to the second. But you can't see me?" He shook his head. "Number with you, everything's blank. That's why our relationship has felt so new to me. So real. You're a blind spot in my life, Nikki, and I love that." There was a heartbeat of silence where the world felt thick with possibility. Then she threw her arms around him, burying her face in his shoulder. He felt the warmth of her breath and the undeniable thrum of her heart. "I believe you," she whispered. "I don't have any rational explanation. But I believe you." He shut his eyes, relief washing over him in waves. "Thank you. I've never had that from anyone before." She drew back, tears glistening at the corners of her eyes, though a gentle smile curved her lips. "So, this means you sometimes know if something bad is going to happen?" Stanley nodded. "Yes. Though my range is limited, it's enough that people, certain people, would do anything to exploit it." Concern etched across her face. "How do you mean?" He hesitated, voice dropping to nearly a whisper. "There's a group, dangerous people, who've tried to track me down. They call themselves PODD. The name felt weighty on his tongue, a reminder of the quiet fear he'd lived with for so long. "Pod?" she repeated, testing the word. "Who are they?" He rubbed the back of his neck, wishing he could downplay the threat. "Just, let's say they're not good news. They want my ability, and I've managed to stay a step ahead of them for now." "Stanley," Nikki said, voice hushed. Her gaze flicked around as though seeing the park in a stark, new light. "That's why you worry about strangers watching you, isn't it?" He nodded, feeling the subtle quake of his own anxieties resurface. "It's why I'm so careful. Because if they get to me—" She pressed a hand gently to his mouth, silencing him. "We'll be careful together," she promised, her eyes unwavering. "I'm not going anywhere." He wrapped his arms around her in a firm embrace. Nearby, a breeze rustled through the tall grass by the pond's edge, where moments earlier, nature had demonstrated a brief but precise dance of life and predation. Now, that small swirl of feathers and water was gone, leaving behind only ripples. After a while, they returned to the picnic blanket. The sky overhead glowed with a late afternoon warmth, the sun dipping just enough to cast long shadows across the lawn. Most of the families had gone. The soccer field was empty, and a few distant joggers were all that remained. They sat in thoughtful silence, half-eaten sandwiches forgotten in their paper wrappers. Nikki kept her gaze on Stanley's face, absorbing each subtle shift of emotion. He wondered, fleetingly, if she would ultimately be frightened off by the weight of what he'd confessed. Yet each time worry rose in his chest, he felt her hand on his, anchoring him. She might not fully comprehend the scope of his secret, but she accepted him. That much was certain. He offered a small, crooked smile, wanting to break the intensity. "Should we at least finish our picnic?" She returned a shaky laugh. "I'm not sure I have the appetite anymore. Too much cosmic revelation for one afternoon." He nodded, packing up their leftover food and folding the blanket. As they walked toward the park's exit, the hush between them spoke volumes. Nikki occasionally glanced at him, eyes full of concern and a flicker of awe, as though seeing him with new clarity. That final step out of the park felt like a crossing of an invisible boundary, one between a life of carefully guarded secrets and a life in which someone else bore a part of the weight. Still, Stanley sensed the magnitude of what lay ahead. Pod was hardly a passing threat. For years he'd managed to keep them at bay, but the mere mention of their name was enough to stir old fears. He slipped an arm around Nikki's waist, drawing her close. She didn't resist, and the warmth of her presence soothed the anxiety brewing within him. If she wanted to stand beside him, he wouldn't push her away, but he couldn't deny that danger lurked somewhere beyond the edges of his limited foresight, waiting for the right moment to pounce. For now, they walked silently into the late afternoon glow, leaving behind an empty patch of grass and a single floating leaf, bobbing on the pond's surface. Nikki said nothing more about Pod that day, only holding him tighter, as if instinctively sensing that the calm they shared was precious and precarious. In the back of Stanley's mind, worry still flickered. He had chosen to bring her into this world of uncertainty, and there was no erasing that decision. But seeing the gentle strength in her eyes reminded him that he had taken the right step, no matter the dangers that might lie ahead. Part 5. Patriots of Doomsday. Stanley didn't usually dwell on his past brushes with danger, but standing in his dimly lit apartment, he couldn't help recalling the moments he'd slipped away from near capture. Years ago, he'd sensed Pod's first attempt before it even began. Men watching him from across the street, a suspicious vehicle idling by the curb. Another time, he recognized one of their operatives disguised as a curious onlooker during his street performances. He narrowly evaded them by abruptly cutting his act short, dashing into alleyways where his knowledge of immediate events helped him stay 3 steps ahead. Though he never told many people about it, those repeated threats had taught Stanley to watch his surroundings constantly. His foresight allowed him to spot the danger just in time. He would see a glint of what was about to happen, a hint of someone's next move. Then he would melt away, leaving Pod's would-be kidnappers frustrated in his wake. But now, with Nikki by his side, he felt a chill run through him at the thought of those near misses. The stakes were no longer just about his own skin. His new fiancée was entwined in everything that mattered to him. He lived with the quiet fear that PODD might become bolder if they learned he was letting someone into his life. He found himself pacing the living room when Nikki stepped in, a file clutched in her hands. By day, her job as an analyst involved poring over data to spot threats. Tonight, it was something much bigger. A hush in her eyes told him so. "I've been working late," she said softly. "You know, since you told me about PODD." Stanley nodded. He could almost taste the tension in the air, as though the entire room thrummed with unseen electricity. "What did you find?" Nikki pulled 2 photographs out of the file, images of 2 somber-faced individuals, each with a determined set to their jaw. "They're FBI agents," she explained. "Undercover. They infiltrated PODD about 3 weeks ago, and now they've disappeared." Stanley felt his stomach tighten. "Disappeared?" "No contact, no signals," Nikki said. "My superiors suspect they've been compromised. That means it could be a matter of days, or even hours, before PODD either kills them or forces them into something terrible." The flicker of a headache began behind Stanley's eyes. He knew all too well how far Pod was willing to go. They weren't just a run-of-the-mill extremist group. They thrived on fear and chaos. "So the FBI wants to bring them home," he murmured, carefully weighing his words. "How do I fit into this? Nikki gazed at him with an intensity that made his heart pound. I told them about your unique edge, she said softly. Not the full story, obviously, but enough to convince them we need you. If we can figure out where PODD is holding those agents, or how to approach them without a bloodbath. She left the sentence unfinished, but Stanley understood. His ability to see short-term future events might mean the difference between life and death for the missing agents. He walked over to the window, peering out at the glowing skyline. Light pollution tinged the horizon a soft orange, lending the entire city an oddly serene aura. It was easy to forget what lurked in its underbelly. You're asking me to do more than just tip the odds. You're asking me to stand in the crosshairs. A quiet hush followed his words, broken only by the hum of traffic far below. Nikki came up beside him, placing a hand gently on his arm. I won't pretend it's safe, but the Bureau has no leads. Nothing. If they do a blind raid, everyone could die. The agents. Innocent bystanders. Stanley shut his eyes, wrestling with the gravity of it. He'd spent so long dodging pod, fleeing rather than fighting. Yet now, there were lives at stake besides his own, and the quiet thought echoed that maybe it was time he stopped running. Tell me what you know about their leader, he said at last, turning to face her. She flipped open another page in the file and revealed a blurred image. A man in a hoodie, face partially obscured. He goes by Chuck on the streets. We know next to nothing about him, except he holds real power within PODD, and he's particularly obsessed with capturing you. He thinks your ability can help them enact a large-scale operation. Stanley tried to keep his voice steady. Then I suppose I need to meet him face to face. Nikki's eyes widened. What? He exhaled slowly, his gaze flicking from the photograph to her. If I want to find out where they're keeping those agents, I have to get inside somehow. Let Chuck think I'm interested in making a deal. A jolt of tension spread through the room. She clenched the file in her hands. That's exactly what the higher-ups are thinking, she admitted. It's a huge risk, but if you can manage even a glimpse of the right location, or glean a clue about how to free them, then we have a chance, he finished, swallowing hard. They spent the next half hour locked in conversation, going over everything Nikki's clearance allowed her to share. Partial intel on POD's structure, bits of data about Chuck's suspected haunts, and theories about how the undercover agents might have been discovered. The details were thin, and the risk soared higher with every new piece of information. Stanley paced the length of the living room, trying to quell the knot in his stomach. He understood what needed to be done, but he couldn't deny the fear pressing on his chest. Every time he imagined walking right into Pod's grasp, he pictured Nikki's face, worried and pale. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice subdued. Stanley, this operation is on the verge of being greenlit. We can't do it without you. But I won't lie. Once you're in their territory, your visions might not save you if they figure out your plan too soon. And if... He gently reached out, cupping her cheek in his hand. I know. Trust me. I know. For a moment, the tension in the room hung like a weighted curtain. Then he stepped back, gathering all of his conflicting feelings into a determined resolution. All right. Let the FBI know I'll do it, he said. I'll approach Chuck in the open, let him see I'm willing to talk. That's our best shot at getting close without spooking him. Nikki blinked rapidly, relief and concern mixing across her features. Thank you, she whispered. I've already cleared the idea with my supervisors, but they wanted your final word. He managed a small, humorless smile. They have it now, for better or worse. Somewhere beneath the heaviness, Stanley felt a glimmer of confidence born from the years he'd spent eluding PODD. This time, though, it wouldn't be about escape. It would be about stepping directly into their stronghold. The idea sent adrenaline racing through him, but he refused to back down. A dull buzz from Nikki's phone signaled an incoming message, and as she scanned it, the shadows in her eyes deepened. No doubt the operation was already in motion. Soon the Bureau would stage their resources, plan their contingencies, and wait for Stanley to make that crucial first move. He drew her into a gentle embrace, pressing his lips to her forehead. Outside, the city lights flickered like silent witnesses to the decision he had just made. Promise me you'll stay close, he said. Even if things go sideways. Nikki nodded against him, her arms tightening around his waist. We're in this together, she replied, her words more reassurance than vow. With that, they stood quietly for a while, sharing a fleeting peace before the storm. Though neither dared voice the fear knotting in their chests, they both understood the risks involved. On the far horizon, PODD loomed like a towering shadow, an enemy he'd evaded for too long. This time, Stanley King would not run. He would walk straight into the lion's den, and he would do it willingly. Part 6. Enter the lion's den. Stanley's footsteps echoed across the damp concrete, each stride heavier than the last. He scanned the busy city street, clusters of pedestrians rushing through the late afternoon din, steam billowing from subway grates, until he spotted a tall man in a dark hoodie standing at the edge of the curb. That had to be Chuck. Pulling his hood low, Stanley approached. Every nerve in his body hummed, reminding him this was the man who'd been hunting him for years, a ghost-like figure at the head of Pod. "You're Chuck?" Stanley asked quietly. The man's eyes flicked toward him, gray and predatory. "Depends on who's asking." Stanley willed his voice to steady. "I'm the one you've been chasing, the street performer who sees things before they happen. Only now, I'm offering my services for a price." At that, Chuck's expression sharpened. He jerked his chin at a side alley. Keeping a hand beneath his jacket, likely on a concealed weapon, he led Stanley out of the throng of commuters. "You're either desperate or crazy," Chuck hissed. "What's stopping me from taking you right now?" Stanley allowed a thin smile. "Because you know you can't outmaneuver me if I see your next move." He paused just long enough for his point to sink in. "Better to have me on your payroll, right?" Chuck didn't move for an excruciating moment, then let out a low chuckle. "Maybe you're worth talking to. Come with me." Within the hour, Stanley found himself inside an abandoned factory by the waterfront, a reputed PODD hideout. Corrugated metal walls loomed overhead, tinted by the amber glow of industrial lights, while armed guards drifted in the shadows. Chuck led him through a series of makeshift corridors, eyes never lingering on one spot for too long. They halted near a locked door, where two of Chuck's men stood watch. "Show me," Chuck said. "Give me a reason not to dump you in the river." Stanley had anticipated such a test. He glanced around, letting his unique foresight guide him. It was as if the near future flickered at the edges of his vision. A stack of crates teetered on rotted beams. He sensed that in exactly 13 seconds, part of the ceiling above it would crack under pressure. "That pile of crates," he said calmly. "You might want to step away." Chuck scowled, but motioned his men aside. Not a moment too soon. The overhead support snapped, sending debris crashing onto the crates with a thunderous clang. Dust swirled in the air, and Chuck's men exchanged startled glances. "Lucky guess," Chuck muttered, though Stanley sensed his respect had inched upward. "This way." Beyond the door was a dim corridor that reeked of stale air. Two more guards stood watch outside another room. Through a small glass pane in the door, Stanley glimpsed the missing agents, bound and sitting on the floor, their faces pale in the harsh fluorescent light. His heart thundered. If Chuck discovered Stanley was here for them, everything would unravel. Holding his composure, Stanley feigned disinterest. "They look rough," he remarked. "What do you need me for?" Chuck snorted. "Information. I can't risk them turning on me or squealing to law enforcement." Stanley masked his dread, studying the agent's condition from the corner of his eye. One of them had an improvised bandage on his shoulder, the blood dried to a dark rust color. Both looked fatigued, possibly dehydrated. He needed to find a way to communicate their location to Nikki before it was too late. "So," Chuck pressed, "are you in?" Stanley nodded curtly. "If you pay, and if you don't lie to me." Chuck smirked. "Trust is a two-way street. I'll find a task for you soon enough. Predict something for me, something that'll earn me a profit, or protect me from a raid." Stanley forced out a confident shrug. "Name your terms." Hours later, after enduring Chuck's relentless grilling and pointed threats, Stanley managed to slip into the factory's break area. A single overhead bulb cast a meager glow, flickering intermittently. With a quick glance to ensure he was alone, Stanley retrieved his phone from an inside pocket. Thanks to a small device disguised as a phone case, something Nikki had arranged, his messages wouldn't register easily on the guard's scanners. He typed swiftly, "To FBI here. Basement, northwest corner. Condition stable but urgent." A few keystrokes more, and he sent the covert signal to Nikki's secure line. Then he powered off the phone, tucking it away. His breath shuddered with a wave of relief and guilt. She had put her career on the line just to let him infiltrate this place. He thought of her anxious smile as he left, how she tried to be brave for him, tried not to show her fear. Now or never, he whispered to himself, bracing for whatever test came next. The next day, Chuck paraded Stanley through a labyrinth of hallways riddled with peeling paint and warped flooring. "Show me something else," Chuck demanded, tone cold as steel. "Something that proves you're not just a run-of-the-mill trickster." Stanley inhaled slowly. His short-term foresight was vivid here. A guard would drop his keys in 10 seconds. A rat would scurry across the next corridor in 30. A generator would cough and sputter in 45. He spoke each event seconds before it happened. The guard yelped as his keys clanged on the floor. The rat darted past them in a blur. The generator rattled, spitting sparks. Chuck's features darkened and lit with each demonstration, hesitation battling greed in his eyes. "All right," he muttered. "You might be useful after all." Stanley's pulse throbbed. He was in deeper than ever, forced to walk a line between proving himself valuable and avoiding suspicion. Every gesture, every word, needed to be carefully measured so he didn't reveal his true motives. Finally, Chuck took him to a narrow hallway that ended in a rusted metal door. A single flickering light bulb overhead cast shadows that danced along the walls. Chuck pointed to the door. "We got something, or someone in there," he said cryptically. "Curious if you already know about that too." Stanley tried to steady his breathing. Another captive? The possibility that PODD held others besides the agents had crossed his mind, but he'd pushed it away. Worse yet, a low whisper in his subconscious reminded him that sometimes the Bureau wasn't the only institution investigating PODD. Could they have discovered an unsuspecting analyst who dug too deep? Chuck yanked the door open and motioned for Stanley to step inside first. Stanley walked in, bracing for the sight of another traumatized prisoner. His gaze snagged on a woman, her wrists bound, her head bowed. Long hair partly obscured her face, but the faint shape of her profile rocked him to the core. He stopped cold, heart slamming so fiercely he thought he might double over. Nikki. She was slumped against a concrete wall, her breathing shallow but steady. Shock coursed through him like an electric jolt. In that instant, his foresight glitched into emptiness. Everything about her presence was a chasm, a gap that swallowed the usual flickers of the future. For a heartbeat, he couldn't think or move. Behind him, Chuck was watching. He forced his expression to remain blank, his breath taut in his throat. "You see anything special?" Chuck asked, voice thick with suspicion. Stanley swallowed, fighting to keep his tone neutral, even as his world tilted off its axis. "Nothing unusual. Just, who is she?" Chuck's laughter rumbled with grim satisfaction. "Some nosy data analyst, from what I hear. She got too close. We're still figuring out what to do with her." Nikki finally lifted her head, dazed confusion flickering in her eyes. Stanley locked gazes with her for a single agonizing second. He had to pretend they were strangers. He had no choice. Silence stretched, brittle with tension. "Well?" Chuck goaded. Stanley drew himself upright, controlling his tremors with all the willpower he had. "She doesn't look like much," he said, forcing a dismissive shrug. "I guess you could use her as leverage. That's what you do, right?" Inwardly, each word stabbed him. But he kept going, knowing he had to maintain the ruse. Just then, Nikki's gaze flickered with recognition. Stanley watched a storm of emotion cross her features, but she said nothing. He turned away before Chuck could see the alarm in his eyes. "Fine," Chuck said, slamming the door shut again. "You want to stay in our good graces? Remember who's in charge here." Stanley nodded, shoulders tense. Together, they left the hallway, the echo of the door slamming still reverberating in his chest. Inside that room, behind that door, was the woman he loved, the same woman he was fighting to protect. He slipped one last glance at her through the small window set into the door. Nikki caught it, despair and relief mingling in her eyes. They both understood the impossible stakes in that instant. And so Stanley King, the man who had evaded Pod for years, now found himself standing face to face with his own fiancée, pretending she meant nothing. The hollow silence drummed in his ears as Chuck ushered him away, deeper into the factory's corridors. He could barely breathe, his mind whirling with possibilities. One thing was certain: the next steps would define everything. Part 7. The Escape. Stanley paced the cramped metal walkway above Pod's makeshift command room, heart pounding as Chuck's ultimatum echoed in his ears. The warehouse beneath him smelled of oil and dust, punctuated by flickering lights that carved tense shadows across the floor. Bound to a chair at one end of the room, Nikki watched him with silent fear, two armed men standing close by. A short distance away, the two missing FBI agents were huddled behind a stack of wooden crates, guarded by a third henchman. Chuck stood at the center of it all, eyes gleaming with cruel intent. He jabbed a finger at a battered, hand-drawn city map spread on a rusted metal table. "I brought you in to create a foolproof plan," Chuck snarled, slamming a fist on the map. "A synchronized strike that will show the world what PODD can do. And if you don't deliver, she dies first. Then them." Stanley tried to maintain composure, though inside he teetered on a razor's edge of dread. Having Nikki near him dulled his usual foresight like a thick fog. Still, snatches of future seconds flickered in his mind's eye, as though illuminated by a faulty flashlight. It was enough to anticipate small moments but never the whole picture. He forced a slow breath. "I'm working on it," he lied, hoping to stall. "But if you want this done right, you have to give me a little more time." A dangerous glint passed through Chuck's gaze. "Your time is running out. Now move." He snapped his fingers, and one of his men shoved Stanley roughly toward the map. "Draft something. Show me you're worth keeping alive." Stanley's mind raced. He had no desire to design an attack. He only needed to keep Chuck believing he was cooperating. Meanwhile, the clock ticked for Nikki and the agents. He glanced at her, mustering a small nod. Anything to reassure her he had a plan. She swallowed hard, returning a faint, trembling nod of her own. He bent over the map, feigning concentration. The pen in his hand felt ice cold. In the back of his mind, disjointed flashes teased him. A looming siren in the distance, a guard stepping away from his post, the split-second arc of a pistol's muzzle. He sensed something was about to happen. Maybe the police had finally traced his signal or grown suspicious of the warehouse's activity. If so, he could use that to his advantage. A sudden wail of sirens sliced through the stillness, echoing across the metal walls. Chuck's gaze snapped upward. "What the—" For Stanley, it was like a spark in a dark room. Adrenaline flooded his system, and he seized upon the fleeting clarity in his short-term vision. In the next breath, he saw exactly how one guard would shift his stance, how another's attention would wander, and how best to move. He bolted from behind the table with explosive speed. A startled guard spun to grab him, but Stanley stepped aside just before the man lunged, as if guided by invisible strings. With a quick elbow strike, Stanley dislodged the guard's weapon, knowing from a flicker of foresight that it would clatter 2 feet away rather than skitter across the entire floor. He scooped it up, heart pounding, and pivoted just in time to see a second henchman raise his own gun. Stanley ducked, the bullet whizzing overhead and embedding in a steel support beam. Before the shooter could fire again, Stanley kicked an old crate in his direction, causing the man to stumble. He dashed forward, knocking the weapon from the henchman's grip in one fluid motion. The man swung a fist wildly, but Stanley sidestepped the blow with a move that felt half instinct, half vision. A swift punch to the gut sent the henchman sprawling. "Stop him!" Chuck roared, voice thunderous as he scrambled for his own firearm. But something else had stolen his attention. The wailing sirens grew louder. The police weren't on site yet, but they were close, enough for Chuck to worry about an immediate confrontation. Seizing the moment, Stanley turned toward Nikki. The guard beside her had loosened his hold out of sheer confusion. Using a split-second glimpse of the man's next move, Stanley fired a warning shot into the ground near the guard's feet, forcing him to retreat. Nikki took the opportunity to wrench free of the ropes binding her wrists. She shot Stanley a look of fierce relief, then stumbled into his arms for the barest second. "Go," he urged, voice ragged. She nodded and dashed behind him as he swung his gun toward the guard watching the two FBI agents. The man hesitated, torn between obeying Chuck or defending himself. In that sliver of indecision, one of the agents, gathering what little energy he had left, rammed his shoulder into the guard, knocking them both to the ground. The second agent scrambled to free himself from his bindings, trembling but determined. "Follow me," Stanley ordered, motioning to a side corridor. He'd glimpsed it earlier, a passage that looped around the building, leading to a back entrance near the old loading docks. The two agents hurried after Nikki, eyes wide with exhaustion and hope. Chuck's roar echoed through the cavernous space as he fired off a round that pinged off the walkway's railing. "You think you can just run away?" he bellowed. "I'll kill every last one of you." Stanley cursed under his breath, trying to maintain his tenuous hold on what few glimpses of foresight he could muster. Nikki's presence still clouded his ability, but bursts of clarity allowed him to see each corner and anticipate every guard's vantage point for the next few seconds. It was enough to chart a path through the labyrinth of crates and catwalks. Guiding the group through the gloom, Stanley turned just in time to see Chuck lining up another shot. He flung himself to the left, dragging Nikki down behind a shipping container as the bullet ricocheted, sending sparks flying. The next breath brought the squeal of heavy machinery. A forklift in the corner was shifting, dislodging a stack of pallets. In the half-second before it happened, Stanley understood. A sudden cascade of wooden crates would divert Chuck's line of sight. He waved the others forward. "Keep moving!" he shouted. Sure enough, the pallets collapsed with a thunderous crash, momentarily scattering Chuck's henchmen and giving Stanley the opening he needed. He lunged out, raising his gun at Chuck. But Chuck, in a fit of rage, squeezed his trigger. The bullet grazed Stanley's arm, pain lancing through him. Gritting his teeth, Stanley squeezed back, aiming low. The shot struck Chuck's shoulder, and he howled, staggering backward with raw shock etched across his face. Blood darkened his shirt as he sank to one knee, fury and disbelief burning in his eyes. Stanley clutched his own wound, spinning to find Nikki and the agents. They had reached the back exit, adrenaline carrying them past their physical limits. He joined them, every breath ragged. The sirens now throbbed just outside the building, accompanied by the clamor of slamming car doors and shouted commands. Dropping the gun, Stanley yanked his phone out of his pocket. Even though the police were practically on their doorstep, he hammered out a quick location update, one final assurance that the authorities knew exactly where to strike. Within moments, beams of flashing red and blue strobed through the grimy windows, painting the entire space in an eerie dance of lights. The door burst open, and uniformed officers poured into the warehouse. The battered henchmen fell back, some raising their hands in surrender, others dashing for cover with no success. Chuck, bleeding from his shoulder, attempted to lift his firearm once more, but found himself rapidly disarmed and pinned. His curses rang through the open space as the police subdued him. Exhausted and trembling, Nikki and the agents leaned against a concrete pillar, relief flooding their expressions. Stanley limped toward them, feeling both the searing pain in his arm and the rush of triumph in his chest. Despite the throbbing ache, he managed a trembling smile. Nikki reached out, gently touching the wound on his arm. "You're hurt," she whispered, tears of mixed relief and alarm clouding her eyes. He managed to place a hand on hers, breath hitching. "Just a graze," he said, the words almost lost to the ambient chaos of shouts and sirens. Officers surrounded them, guiding the injured agents to waiting paramedics and checking on Nikki's condition. Over by a fallen stack of crates, Chuck and the rest of the PODD operatives were being cuffed, faces grim or filled with silent rage. The warehouse air felt different now, less oppressive, as though a weight had finally lifted. In the swirl of red and blue lights, Nikki and Stanley found themselves momentarily alone in the crowd. She flung her arms around him, and he winced but held her tight, needing no words to express the fierce relief coursing through both of them. This was the moment they had risked everything for: survival and victory in the face of looming darkness. Around them, officers hurried to secure the scene, and paramedics rushed to treat wounds. The clamor of the police presence grew, Yet within that swirl of activity, Stanley and Nikki stood locked in a quiet embrace, hearts pounding, souls exhausted, but finally free from the grasp of Pod's brutal captivity. They watched as Chuck was led away in handcuffs, his glare smoldering. A team of medics coaxed the FBI agents onto stretchers, checking vitals and offering water. Overhead, the dull hum of helicopter blades suggested that the entire area was now under thorough surveillance. Yet for one profound moment, all Stanley could feel was the steady beat of Nikki's heart against his own, the affirmation that they had made it through. They were safe. And as the last echo of sirens faded into the night, he allowed himself a shaky breath, finally at peace that the immediate danger was over. Part 8. A New Path Awaits. Stanley stood under an arch of fresh white lilies, his heart thumping with a combination of nerves and wonder. He could feel the warm sun on his shoulders, see the rows of smiling friends and family seated on either side of the aisle. But what made his palms sweat most was the woman in front of him, about to speak vows that he, of all people, had not the faintest clue how to predict. Nikki's gaze caught his, and he was struck once again by how he could see every tomorrow for every other person in the world, except her. The minister gave a small nod, indicating it was time for her to speak. She held Stanley's hands with a gentle, trembling grip, then took a steadying breath. "Stanley," she began, voice quavering just enough to betray her emotion. "You came into my life as a mystery, and every day since has been a discovery. Together we faced the unimaginable. But through it all, you've taught me the beauty of living in each moment. You make the future, whatever it may be, feel like an adventure, rather than something to fear." A tender hush fell over the small crowd. Stanley's throat tightened, his eyes glimmering with tears. He had been unsure what Nikki might say, unable to peek at any snippet of her next words, and they landed straight in his heart. She spoke of trust, of laughter shared, of overcoming dangers that had once loomed so large. Above all, she promised to be his unexpected tomorrow, forever uncharted. When she finished, Stanley could barely speak. He managed to squeeze her hands, offering a tearful smile that, for a moment, said more than any vow of his own could. Then he gathered himself, stammering through words of gratitude and love, letting the raw honesty guide him. He placed a Preselli bluestone ring, echoing the one he'd once used to propose, onto her finger. Sunlight danced over the stones, as though bestowing its blessing. Moments later, amid applause and cheers, they sealed their vows with a kiss. In that instant, Stanley felt every fraction of time compress into a single, radiant joy. Weeks turned into months, and married life settled in with surprising ease. They rented a cozy 2-bedroom apartment at first, content to share small dinners by lamplight and slow mornings with coffee on the balcony. One rainy evening, as thunder rolled in the distance, Nikki quietly laid a home pregnancy test on the kitchen table. Stanley blinked at the double lines as his heart pounded, the weight of the news spiraling through him. "You're pregnant?" he whispered, voice thick with emotion. Nikki nodded, eyes shining. She cupped his cheek. "I'm as shocked as you are, but I'm so happy. Are you okay?" Tears formed in Stanley's eyes as he pulled her into a fierce hug. Joy and fear swirled within him. Fear of what it meant to bring a child into a world he could not fully control, not when his ability was patchy at best around Nikki. But elation flooded every vein, drowning out his doubts. "I'm more than okay," he managed, voice muffled against her shoulder. They soon decided on a name, Albert, inspired by Albert Einstein's discovery that space and time were intertwined in ways few truly understood. Stanley teased that he hoped their child would take after Einstein's genius. Nikki quipped that she just wanted him to be kind and curious, no matter his IQ. They both laughed, breathlessly excited for the life growing between them. In time, they found a modest home on the outskirts of the city, a cottage-like place surrounded by tall oak trees and a neighboring stream that serenaded them on quiet nights. The yard needed a little work, but it offered space for a garden and a nursery with a wide window that caught the morning sun. Nikki, eager to step away from certain stresses of her old role, accepted a position at FEMA, where her analytical skills helped shape emergency response strategies. It was a post that involved data crunching and forward planning. Precisely the kind of challenge that set her mind alight. She loved knowing she could still protect people, only now through preparation and proactive measures rather than direct confrontation. Stanley, looking for a way to support their growing family, turned to a career that melded his peculiar talent with careful discretion. He became a professional gambler, though professional might have sounded grander than it was. He worked small tournaments, visited casinos with low profiles, and made sure to lose more often than he won. On the nights his foresight paid off, he'd allow himself a modest haul before intentionally dropping a hand or two, keeping the pit bosses unsuspecting. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was enough to pay the bills and support Nikki's new role. They spent their evenings cooking simple meals, sometimes wandering the quiet roads that wound through their neighborhood, sometimes chatting about the day's events in hushed excitement. Preparation for Albert's arrival filled their weekends, painting the nursery walls a gentle shade of pastel, picking out a sturdy crib and the softest blankets they could find. Despite all the changes, one thing remained a constant source of wonder for Stanley: the fact that Nikki continued to be a blind spot. Even as their lives grew intertwined, every future moment containing her was tinged with uncertainty. He could detect the next hand in a poker game, sense the weather shift tomorrow morning, but Nikki's actions, her laughter, her heartbreaks, her joys, they remained veiled. And he realized that, strangely enough, he wouldn't want it any other way. On a spring afternoon, Stanley and Nikki stood together in the garden, a breeze carrying the scent of budding flowers. Nikki rested a hand on her slightly rounded belly, a secret smile playing on her lips. Stanley wrapped an arm around her shoulders, breathing in the moment. "I still can't see what you'll say or do next," he told her softly, a mix of reverence and amusement in his tone. Nikki glanced up at him. "Good," she teased. "I like keeping you on your toes." He grinned, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. In the sunlight, the Precelli bluestone on her ring finger shone. As always, it reminded him of the solid ground they'd found in each other, no matter how unpredictable life had become. They lingered like that, feeling the easy rhythm of contentment that filled their days now. Beyond the edges of their property, the world moved on, with new threats and new wonders waiting in its folds. But for Stanley and Nikki, there was a peaceful certainty in their shared love, even if it came laced with the mystery of an unseen future. Because in a universe where time often felt as changeable as the weather, this small family found their anchor in the one place Stanley couldn't look, the unknown he would happily embrace with Nikki by his side. And for them, that was more than enough. The end.